not just tomorrow. It's not tomorrow. They're not useful for that. And like when you look at the gold chart, which we will look later, you can actually see, even though gold had a big sell-off after 2011, it's actually in a very long-term bull market. And you can tell this from the chart. And that means it will go back up and it will go much higher. So that's extremely valuable information. Now other assets are not. So these charts like give us a lot of hints. But first we will hear from David Harris, who will give his whatever title for your talk.
Hello everyone, thanks for coming along. I'll give you an update on what's happened since last month. Not a lot of change since last month. Possibly the dollar is moving a little higher now. The markets have moved a little higher. I still think we're in a topping process in the US in terms of equities. So it's going to look very similar to last month in terms of presentation, but just a few things have changed. So this is a cartoon I've been showing for a while now. It's got the new President Trump running up the hill, the bulls chasing afterwards, and this time they were chasing down 21,000. We've gone a lot higher than that since then. We've gone to 22,000, and then now even above that recently, just in the last few days, we're up nearly 22,900. But I do think that we're going to have a drop. There's been a lot of negative news, poor ratings, threat from North Korea, hurricanes, and no new legislation yet from Congress, significant legislation that is, and yet the market's still been pretty resilient. But I think we'll get to a point where it's going to come down. Initially I thought we'd have a correction of maybe 10 to 20%, but I do think now we'd potentially be going to a bear market of 20% or more, in the range of 20 to 29%, and I'll explain why through the presentation. So this goes back quite a long way. This is a weekly view of the Dow, 2013, 14 and 15. I got a signal back in June 2014, a very, very reliable signal going back 130 years on the Dow. It finds all the major tops on the market, and at that point I knew that a top would form. The top forms anything around about an average of 9 months afterwards. So it's a reliable signal, but it takes a while for the top to form. So based on that signal I developed another tool which creates windows of opportunity or windows of probability where the tops are likely to happen. And those red boxes are on this weekly chart. There are also windows 5 and 6 off in 2016, which we'll come across in later slides. But I also, on the daily charts, I've superimposed the windows that come off that analysis, and there's the A and B in blue. And at the time I said that where window B and window 4 overlap was probably a good point for a market top. And as we go forward we see that the Dow did top out where window B and window 4 coincide. So we came down into late 2015, early 2016, two very low points in the Dow. We came back up, this is window 5. We formed a lower high at that point in window 5.
Yeah. Good sign up.
And then we carried on from that low point in 2016 all the way up with a rally into the election last year. I said at this point, in about 3/4 of the way through the year, we'd go up to year end and possibly come down. We actually did go up, and we've gone a lot higher since. So then we had a market top forming, not last year, but now 2017, and we climbed up higher. Got a signal in February, which is a daily signal, telling me that the top is nearby. And then there was a signal in March, but that disappeared.
Good.
And as we went through the year, we got another signal in June of this year on the weekly chart. We then had a daily and a weekly signal. And we have the red boxes are weekly analysis, the blue boxes are daily analysis. So 7 is red, D is blue. We also have signals on the Nasdaq and SP 500. So we've got lots of signals coming along that the top is near, a few months away. And we've got a lot of volume during that period, so the market's high, a lot of volume, which means a lot of shares are changing hands at the moment. Just looking very closely at that, I showed last week that window 7 and window D, actually if you go close up and inspect it at a closer level of granularity, they actually break down. So window D breaks down into window DA and DB, window 7 breaks down into 7, A, B and C, and where they overlap, which is these 3 purple boxes, again, is a possible point where the market may top out. The next chance for this to happen where the windows overlap is actually beginning of next year. So we had a top formed in that second purple box. If we go forward, we had around about the time of the meeting last month in September, we went up into the third purple box. And I said by September 22nd, when that purple box ended, we could see a top in the market. Not guaranteed, but it could be. It's a high probability. But actually what's happened over the last few weeks, as you know, the market's powered even higher. And that tells me that those three boxes are probably, or they are now, unlikely chances, but the next box in early next year might be a chance for a top. I haven't got it shown on this chart, but hopefully next month as we move along in time, we'll see it. And that's January 1st through to March 9th next year. There still is a probability that the market may top out between now and that point. But certainly the next high probability window for a top is January 1st to March 9th next year. There's a window 8 on the weekly chart forming. Looking at those two signals that are formed, the daily signal in February and the weekly signal in June, this is going back historically 100 years. These are the times when you've got both the daily and the weekly signal happening together. Not all of these are big drops. So 1994, only 12%, 2015, 16%, and then again here in 50s, just 14%. But some of them are quite significant. So some of the very large drops we've seen either in our lifetime or in the history books before our lifetime. We've got 2007, 2000, which we've lived through. There was a big drop in 87, some will remember that. And then even going way back to the Great Depression, 50 and 90% were recorded back, and those are items 13 and 14 on this. So not always, but certainly when we get daily and weekly signal together, it can be a point where you can see a strong downturn in the markets. This is a quarterly chart of the Dow. Every candlestick is 3 months of activity. Got the 2007 top in October that year, 2009 bottom in March. And we have a particular pattern which I've been using for the last few years. Three-phase pattern. Phase 1 is a change in direction. So for an upward move, the first change is from down to up. You then get second phase, which is 9 candlesticks all in a row. That's the acceleration phase, and then the third phase is the consolidation phase, which continues on after the acceleration, and that's up to 13 candlesticks. We've reached 12 candlesticks in early 2015, which is why it looked like a top was going to form, and that was the first few slides of this presentation. So around about that time, that candlestick 12, it looked like that had almost finished. We did get that high in May 2015. And then towards the end of last year, we actually got to candlestick 13. So in Q3 of last year, we got to the end of that cycle. So phase 3 then went from dotted line to solid line. And at that point, and I'll show you in the next few slides why, at that point there's a chance that we're going to see quite a strong downturn. And this is a particular pattern that's happened over and over again over the last 100 years. Got a downward trend in volume, but a very large spike, as we saw earlier on, just in the last few months. So taking this pattern and looking back over the last 100 years, I formed a chart which I've been showing the last few months. So 2016, which was last year, Q3, when the pattern finished. We're now 5 quarters on to the top. I'll put it in red dotted line because the top hasn't formed yet, but the top is at least 5 quarters on from when the pattern finished in Q3 of 2016. We don't know where the market low is or what the drop is, but if I go back through the last 100 years, 1997, the pattern completed in Q1, the top was 2 quarters later, and the market low was 3 quarters later, so there's a quarter difference in terms of the top and the bottom, and the drop was 17%. 1992, the pattern finished in Q2, market top was in the same quarter, and then 2 quarters later the market low happened, the drop was only 10%. If I then finish the rest of that analysis all the way back to 1915 rather, that's the pattern forming, and then a drop happening. So we've got anywhere between 10 and 29% drop after that pattern is completed. Looking over the last 10 instances, most of these have been 0, 1 or 2 quarters after the pattern finished. The only other time historically was at the end of the Second World War, where the rally was strong and it went 5 quarters, which is where we are now at the moment. So we're at the upper limit of how this pattern forms. Doesn't mean we can't go any further, we may do, but certainly we're at the upper limit in this case. If we then take the market lows, most of those are just 1, 2 or 3 quarters after the top, but some of them, 2 of them with those red dots, they actually went 6 quarters on. so the potential for probably 1, 2 or 3 quarters for the bottom to form, but could be as much as 6 quarters, a year and a half. If we take those cases where the market top was the highest points beyond the pattern, so +2, +2, +5, we look across, those had 17, 28, 24%, so statistically likely in the upper teens or even in the 20s in terms of a percentage drop. A couple of models now to go through the flash crash model, which predicts the likelihood of a flash crash happening, and also waterfall drops in price. So this particular model I developed, I got a series of dates that came out in the model. I was really looking for price weakness, and what I found was 2 particular dates, those in red circles, May 2010 and August 2015, was when we actually saw a flash crash in the market. And so the model doesn't only find flash crashes. The other points in time were where we had serious drops in the market, so it finds waterfall drops that are significant and worthy of note, and protection of a portfolio if you have a portfolio you want to protect by hedging. But it certainly is a reasonable chance it will catch the next flash crash, should there be one in coming years. Rolling this model forward from end of 2015, I'll skip through, we had some signals early 2016, January, May and July, and sure enough we had a very significant drop in that January signal. And then the other signals have pushed off. We haven't seen the significant drop, we've seen the climb up in the rally through the election to where we are now. I think that's the final one there. No, that's the final one there. So that's where we are now as of end of last week. So potentially if the market were to come down, we could see a significant drop or a flash crash as we go into the late half of this year or even early next year. Same model but on a large time scale, looks at bear markets and also is a fairly good indicator of US recessions. So this now is a very long range view of the Dow Jones starting from as early as 1987, and that there is the crash in 87. Doesn't look so ominous now, but that was a 30% drop in the market. But we've got a lot higher since then. So each of the red signals are outputs from the model which tell us that something significant is about to happen. It's predictive, so it tells us something's going to happen, not that it has happened, which is beneficial. So looking just at the final part of this long-range view of the Dow, just the last few years. We had a signal in Q4 2015 and the market came down in the August timeframe. We now have signals in Q4 this year, so where we are now, Q1 next year and Q1 the year after. So it's looking like once the market does turn south, there could be either a bear market or a recession or both. So the probability is quite high of seeing that. Moving on to other views of mapping out and modelling the US recession. There's a particular model at St. Louis Fed, which I look at. Here are some outputs for April and October this year. There was a very small alert that in April that cleared, and this is the most recent report. It comes out usually the first or second day of the month. This one came out on I think the 2nd of October, which was a Monday last week. And it shows data up to July, so it's always about 3 months delayed. So the data up to July in the October report shows us no significant risk of a recession at the moment in the US. I take the output from this model and I run it through an analysis tool which tells me when a recession is likely to start and end. This is the output where we are at the moment, and there's not much activity happening, but I want to track real time in this meeting month by month to see when the next recession starts. Showing you what actually happened in the last recession, so snapping back a few years. This is what the data looks like in the model on this Excel spreadsheet when we actually have a recession. So the first column here is just a line indicator, number 1 to 26. The second 2 columns are the month and the date of the report, so the month and year of the report. The next column there is the probability of a recession. You see it can be as low as under 1%, but it climbs up to 60, 70%, and even higher up to 100% during the recession. And that's their prediction, and that's their probability of a recession being actually happening in real time. This is the reference of the data, so it's usually about 3 months behind the report. So the report in August, the data was as good as May. This column comes out of the National Bureau of Economic Research, NBER. This is they're the official ruling of whether there's a recession or not. So month by month they'll either say there is a recession or there isn't a recession, and that signal there comes from that agency. I then have a series of risks and alert warnings that come out there, and they're a little relaxed, so they'll start before recession begins, and they'll finish off probably after recession ends. But the real signal that I produce, based on this probability, so I analyse this probability with a set of rules, that's the signal I get. So hopefully real time we'll be able to see as the next recession starts whether it's happening and whether we actually map well against the output from the NBER. In this particular case, looking at those two columns there, actually got it, the model gets it exactly right, so all of those months correctly identified a US recession. And then at the end, the final column, it spits out a signal the last month or two telling you a recession is probably ending. So it gives you the beginning, the length, and the end of the US recession. This was some analysis that I read about back about a year ago now, when the presidential election was taking place. Someone had pointed out that every time a new president comes into the White House, there's a recession, and I looked into this. They'd actually missed off Bill Clinton, and it wasn't actually true that just every time there's a new face. I dug into the data and came up with the fact that whenever there's a new Republican president, there's nearly always a recession. And so much so that if you actually go back, every US president, or every term where a US president and a Republican president's come in, there's always been a recession going back to 1850. And only if you look at those 7 Republican presidents who had a second term, each of the ones that had a second term had a recession in the first and their second term, except for Ronald Reagan. So since 1850, the only Republican president not to have a recession during their period in office was Ronald Reagan in his second term. Some observations from the analysis I did: 70% of the US recessions beginning year 1 and year 2. I think that's probably because the administration likes to try and get the bad news over in the first part of their term and then try to have better news in the second term. So some of the decisions made in the first 2 years possibly might bring on a recession. They certainly don't want it to happen in the second 2 years because they want to get re-elected. The length and frequency of recessions have reduced significantly since the formation of the Fed. It used to be 40% of the time the US was in recessions. Now it's only 15%, so you've seen quite a significant reduction in terms of what the Fed has done for all the complaints it gets against it. Time between US recessions typically during the 19th century was short, about 24 to 36 months, or 2 to 3 years. More recently, there have been much longer, with the 8 longest recession-free periods since 1860, nearly 160 years, being 45, 49, 57, 72, 79, 91, 105 and 119 months. Now, these are the longest ones. They're not necessarily in order, so the ones with red bars happened later than some of the records. So these two happened after that one, this one happened after that one, so they're not necessarily in order. But if we actually look at the ones in order, the record only gets broken about every 30 or 40 years. So in this case, going through the numbers again, 1861 to 1865 was a 45-month period. The next record got broken in 1933 to 37, that was 49 months. Then in 38 to 45, 79 months. Then much more recently, 61 to 69, 105 months. And then the recent record, the longest the US has ever gone without recession, 91 to 2001, 190 months. That's the current record. So just remembering that number there. Currently we've gone 100 months since the last US recession in June 2009. And by May 2019 we'll have gone 119 months since the last recession. That's the same record again. So you either beat it this time and we go longer, so we go past May 2019, or possibly the recession starts and that record doesn't get beaten, because it only gets beaten, I said, every 30 to 40 years. The recession is likely to start in the next 12 to 15 months, between now and May 2019. And certainly by the next US presidential election in 2020, we'll be gone 136 months, which means that we'll have gone way past the record of 119. It's possible, but it's a huge stretch, which means that more than likely we're going to see a recession during Donald Trump's period of office, and that will be the next US president, Republican, and another recession. So that would keep the original analysis I showed you going in terms of recessions happening time and time again with the Republican presidents. So conclusions: there's reasonably high probability we'll see a recession before the end of next year, because it happens in year 1 and year 2. Within 14 months, so next year could be a bad year. There's also a very strong chance it will happen by the next general election in 2020. Looking at GDP very quickly, going back to the beginning of last year, we saw a movement up and down. This is a model by the Atlanta Fed, and they produce ahead of time before the final numbers are produced by the government agency that produces them. I forget which one, I think it's NEA. They had a move upwards in GDP as they estimated. It came down towards the end. The final result was quite close to their estimate. So their estimate was 0.6 in red, the final number in purple was 0.8. Then Q2 saw the same kind of pattern, the move upwards at the beginning, and then the analysis showed a drop down later. Again, sharp turn down in terms of estimate, but the final result was quite a lot higher, went back up to 3.5% Q3 last year. And there's a little move up and then down with a final number of 2.1 for Q4. And then moving to this year, a move up, then a sharp move down to Q2, the advanced primary, and then final number of 1.4. Q2 this year, the advanced estimate 2.6, 3, and then 3.1 in September, so that's just recently. And then the current estimate for Q3, we're seeing a start at 4%, it's gone down 3%, and now 2.5%. So the estimate for Q3 GDP at the moment by Atlanta Fed is 2.5%. We'll see a final result for that in a month or so's time. Look at the VIX very quickly. I've been analysing the VIX. You see the same pattern we saw on the Dow, but the inverse. The VIX goes opposite to the market. So a phase 1 change in direction, phase 2 and phase 3. We've got to candlestick 11, we'd want to get to candlestick 13. We've actually gone through that and come out. Here we are, April, June. We saw significant lows in the VIX. In February, it was a multi-year low, and then June, a very long low, going way back to 1993, which is the inception of the VIX. And then what we've seen very recently in July was the lowest ever value in the VIX, so longer than the entire history of the VIX. And here we are now in, for some reason I don't have last few months, I'm not sure what it was. No, I didn't change the indicator up there. So that's where we are in October. I just didn't change the indicator at the top. So we've come back down again in the VIX, indicating a certain amount of complacency in the market. The market's still at a very high point, but it's at an all-time high at the moment. Treasury notes, we had at the low, middle of last year, and I predicted back in 2014 when I started doing these presentations that the low of 1.39% that happened in 2012 would probably be revisited at some point, and we did see that, and it actually went to the same level and just a little bit lower to 1.34%. So we got something like a double bottom. The question is whether we actually get down to that bottom again and go lower or bounce off, and that's the lowest we'll see in our lifetime. So we bounced off that low of last year, an all-time low, and we are here in October, can't spell October. And the rates of the 10-year notes are bouncing around. They're not bouncing up significantly. So if we do see a recession in the next year or two, we could see a rush into treasuries as safe haven, and we then could see yields come down again. They could revisit these lows, and we might then get a triple bottom or even lower lows. Currencies. This is a long-term view of the dollar. One thing I noticed was the recession in 2000 and 2007, we saw a rise in the dollar, and I predicted back a year ago we'd probably see a rise in the dollar out of where we were. My thoughts are that during a recession, people buy treasuries as a safe haven. To buy treasuries if you're overseas, you have to buy dollars first, and therefore you have to change your currency to dollars, and the buying of dollars by people around the world to buy treasuries pushes the dollar stronger during those periods. Just looking at those last few years close up, same pattern, phase 1, phase 2 acceleration, phase 3. At the end of last year, beginning of this year, we got to candlestick 8, and I thought at that point we'd reached an all-time, a local high at that point, not an all-time high. I thought we would probably come down, even though we need to get to candlestick 13 to finish on phase 3, we'd come down and possibly back up again. And as we've gone through the year, we've seen a drop in the dollar, but just recently, there's a flat point there with the dotted line, we've just seen the dollar come back up again. So the question is, has it bottomed and plateaued there and coming back up again, or will it go further down? I think if the market is still trying to reach candlestick 13, we'll see it come up from that point, and we'll have to watch that over the next few meetings. The euro is exactly the mirror image of the dollar. So we see this time phase 1 down, phase 1 change in direction, phase 2 acceleration down, and phase 3. again down to candlestick 8, and at that point the mirror image will then be rise up and rise down to get to candlestick 13, and sure enough we've seen exactly the same. It's the dollar, but as the mirror image, we've gone up, dotted line there, and we've come back down a little bit. So the question is, does the euro follow the dollar, do the opposite and come back down again? This is the Bitcoin chart which we've been looking at for the last few quarters. It seems to be in a bubble. It's risen very quickly, exponentially, and you see for the RSI several times now it's jumped over the 80-point line, which is an indication that something very excessive is happening. We see a phase 1, phase 2 on the Bitcoin, and we see, as I pointed out, we've crossed over the 80-point line on the RSI. I put some notional, I haven't got enough data, I need at least 4 to 5 years of data to run the model I have. So I put in dotted boxes a couple of points where we might see a top in Bitcoin. And we've gone up, there's phase 3, and then more recently, I think even just in the last few days, we've gone up and challenged that recent top of a few months ago. So we're up into potentially that second red box.
It hit 5,000.
Yeah, and the last few days it's climbing
This morning,
very
yeah.
rapidly. Yeah. So I don't know whether that bubble is reaching an end point, but it's certainly in a bubble and it's going to crash.
Okay, you have 10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. Looking at the Dow, there are 30 stocks in the Dow, and I've been looking at 8 over the last few years that seem to be in a bubble. That's about a quarter. Apple specifically, but also Boeing, Amex, Home Depot, United Healthcare, Visa, Nike, and Disney. Particularly looking at Apple, this is a picture of 3D Corp, just to show you the typical view of a bubble. It's usually straight up and then crashes straight down. That's one peak, but you can get 2 peak and 3 peak bubbles. 2 peaks are rare, 3 peaks are very rare, but what we're seeing in Apple is a 3 peak bubble. So Apple's been growing exponentially, it's got these 3 peaks, and usually when you get to the 3rd peak it's running out of steam and it won't go much further. So I have the feeling that Apple, once this final peak tops and comes down, we'll see quite a
David, point out the volume.
the volume's declined, yes. So yeah, you've got a peak in volume through this period, and then the volume's trickled down during that period. So even though the price has been going up, the interest has been waning in terms of volume of trading. But I do expect to see Apple come down significantly at this point. Bubbles usually crash 30 to 50% in price, and sometimes more. Not sure yet, but I built a life cycle model of a bubble. So as this bubble sort of forms and topples, I should be able to calculate the point where we'll see the price come down to. That's the first peak, that's the second peak, and that's where we are. We're not sure whether that peak will happen at the end of this year or next year, but it's certainly a rhythmic 3-year cycle there. This is Apple from the early part of last year. I'd actually predicted way back in early 2015 that we'd probably reach a peak at that point and come down, and we did. The dotted line was that bubble deflated, that part of the bubble deflating. It didn't really come down below the dotted line, so it re-inflated, and if the bubble doesn't fully deflate properly, it will re-inflate quite quickly and go even higher. So it's possible then that through this 3-peak bubble of Apple, we haven't seen the full deflation yet. In this final 3rd cycle, we might see the final and full deflation of the Apple price. So we're going through to the end of last year, early this year, climbing higher, and here we are now in October. We reached that. That's the 2nd peak, and that's the 3rd peak. So as we go end of this year into early next year, we might see that peak come back down significantly. This is a monthly chart. We have phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 downwards. That phase 3 looked as if that was a downward trend that was going to continue, but that was negated by this very strong, in the red colour, this very strong upward trend, which broke that, so that downward trend was cancelled. But we might see that same phase 1, phase 2, 3 start again as we go into next year. So this is net income for Apple. There was this exponential rise up in 2012, and from that point in 2012 was where the second peak, the 1st peak was formed. And from that point on, it hasn't really done very well in terms of net income. It's actually an average of about 44. It's been flat. But think about bubbles, you get this exponential growth, not just in the share price, but also in other internal things like net income or revenue or advertising revenue for a particular stock. And you see this with Apple. We're going to see it again in the next few slides. The FANG stocks, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, and Google are 4 particular stocks. They're also in a bubble. And there are 18 altogether, so there's some biotech stocks I've been looking at, and also some other stocks down there. All have been in or are in a bubble at the moment. Particularly the FANG stocks. Facebook has risen very dramatically from its early days, and it's got the same kind of exponential rise, not just in its